The wreckage came in silence. No explosion, no warning. Just a broken ship drifting through the dark between stars, tumbling slowly, trailing frozen gas and scattered metal the way a wounded animal drags its leg behind it. The patrol craft of the Drakari Empire had picked up the signal an hour ago. Their instruments read it clearly. A small human vessel, relay class, destroyed. No weapons fire. No enemy contact. Just the slow, quiet kind of death that space gave to things that did not belong in it. Dragon Lord Varek stood at the observation window of his patrol ship and looked at the wreckage without speaking. He was large even by Drakari standards, dark-scaled, with eyes the color of cooling iron. He had been born into the first clutch, raised on power, and had spent 300 years learning that the universe sorted everything into two categories: things that endured and things that did not. The broken human ship was a clear example of the second kind. His second officer, a young dragon named Osek, moved up beside him. Salvage survey is complete, Lord. No survivors. Human construction, relay class, civilian designation. It appears the atmospheric system failed. Slow death. Osek paused. They likely had hours. They would have known. Varek said nothing to that. He kept his eyes on the wreckage. Shall we log it and continue the patrol route? Send a boarding crew. Full inventory. Osek lowered his head. Yes, Lord. The boarding crew came back with metal fragments, scorched data cores, and one emergency pod. The pod was small, dented on one side, and its signal beacon had burned out, which was why no one had found it sooner. The crew set it down in the cargo bay and reported to Varek that the life support indicator on its side was still green. Barely, but green. Varek opened it himself. Inside, packed in the foam padding of a survival seat built for something much larger, was a human infant. A girl, by the look of her. She was small enough that Varek could have held her in one hand. She had no scales, no claws, no ridge along her spine. She had soft skin the color of dark river clay, a mess of black hair that stuck up in 4 directions, and 2 wet brown eyes that opened the moment the pod seal broke and stared up at him without blinking. She did not cry. She simply looked at him. The crew stood back. None of them had seen a human infant up close. Most of them had never seen a human at all. One of the younger soldiers made a quiet sound of discomfort, as though proximity to the creature might be contagious. Varek stared down at her for a long time. Among the Drakari, there was one law older than any emperor, older than the empire itself, older even than the wars that had shaped the stars around them. You do not abandon a hatchling. It did not matter whose hatchling it was. A hatchling found alone was a hatchling in need. The law was not written anywhere. It did not need to be. Every dragon knew it the way they knew how to breathe. She comes with us, Varek said. Osek opened his mouth. Varek looked at him. Osek closed his mouth. They brought her to Vareth, the Drakari home world, a planet of redstone and ancient heat where the sky was always the color of deep amber and the mountains had not moved in 10 million years. Varek's estate sat at the edge of the highland plateau, a structure of black stone and open corridors built for creatures much larger than a human child. He assigned 2 household servants to manage her immediate needs and sent for every piece of information the Empire had on human biology. There was not much. Humans had not entered Drakari space before. The fact that they were now sending relay vessels in this direction was itself a matter of ongoing concern to the Council. The infant was given a room. She was fed. A medic was brought in to confirm she was healthy, which she was, in the way that small fragile things are sometimes healthy without quite making sense. Varek visited her on the 3rd night. She was awake, lying on her back in the sleeping pod his servants had built for her, staring at the ceiling. When he came in and lowered himself to look at her, she looked back. You have no name, he said. He was speaking Drakari, of course. She did not understand a word of it. She reached up and grabbed one of his claws with both her tiny hands and held on. He let her. Lyra, he said after a while. It was not a Drakari name. It was a word from an old trade dialect that meant, roughly, the thing that remains. He had chosen it while looking at the wreckage of her ship and thinking about the 2 categories the universe sorted things into. She was the 3rd kind, apparently, the kind that should not have remained, and did anyway. She grew up on Vareth, in the estate of the first clutch, surrounded by dragons. It was not a cruel life. That must be said plainly. No one struck her. No one starved her. She was clothed and educated and given access to every library the estate held. When she was sick, she was treated. When she was slow to learn something, she was corrected and told to try again. In many ways, Varek gave her more than most Drakari children received, because Drakari children were expected to fight their own way through difficulty from an early age, and Varek made small accommodations for the fact that she was human, and humans were physically softer. But there were things she did not receive. When Dran, Varek's second son, fell during a training exercise and broke 2 ribs, Varek stood over him and said, "Get up. Pain teaches. Let it speak." Dran got up. That was love, in the Drakari way. The belief that to shield someone from difficulty was to weaken them. The belief that to push someone through difficulty was to honor them. Lyra received the same. When she fell, she was told to rise. When she was afraid, she was told that fear was information, not permission. When she was lonely, which she was, often, though she had no name for it, she was given a task to do, because idle minds grew soft, and soft things did not survive. She learned Drakari before she could read. She learned 3 more languages before she was 10. She studied history, diplomacy, military strategy, and the long, slow politics of an empire that had outlasted 100 civilizations. She was, by every Drakari measure, an excellent student. She was also, by every Drakari measure, not quite right. Too small. No scales. No fire. She could not participate in the flame bond ritual that marked the passage of every young dragon into adulthood. She stood at the edge of that ceremony when Dran went through it, at age 40 by dragon reckoning, which was perhaps equivalent to 16 in human years, and she watched the fire move between father and son and felt something in her chest that she did not have a word for. She asked Varek about it that evening, not about the feeling. She did not have the language for the feeling. She asked about love. She had heard the word in an intercepted human transmission that she had been asked to help translate. The word had no clean equivalent in Drakari. The closest word was something like deep commitment born of strength. But the way the humans in the transmission used it, it seemed to mean something different. Looser. Warmer. She could not parse it. "Varek," she said, standing at the threshold of his study with her hands clasped behind her back the way he had taught her, "what is love? In the human sense?" Varek looked up from the maps he had been studying. He considered her question with the patience he gave most things, slowly, without rushing. "In the human sense," he said at last, "I cannot say. I have not studied them closely enough. But I will tell you what I believe it is, in any sense that matters. Love is what makes a dragon turn back toward the nest when every instinct says to flee. It is strength, directed inward, pointed at something worth keeping." He looked at her steadily. "If it is anything less than that, it is sentiment. And sentiment is a luxury that does not survive difficult conditions." Lyra nodded. She filed it away with everything else she had been taught. She did not know, then, that she was filing away only half of an answer. She did not know there was another half. She had nothing to compare it to. The years passed. She became precise, capable, and quietly unreachable, the way that people become unreachable when they spend enough time in places where there is no one quite like them. She was fluent in 7 languages, competent in 2 more, and could hold her own in any strategic discussion the Drakari Council produced. She wore Drakari formality like a second skin. She stood straight. She showed nothing. The day Varek named her the Empire's first envoy to human space, she stood in the great hall of the council and received the appointment without expression. There was no flutter in her chest, no fear, no excitement. The Drakari around her read this as composure, which it was. They also read it as readiness, which it was. What they did not read, because they did not know to look for it, was the very small, very old ache behind her ribs that had never been named, that had lived in her since the night she stood at the edge of the flame bond ceremony and watched something pass between a father and his son that she had never been given, not because she was unloved, but because no one around her knew what she needed. She walked out of the council hall and into the amber light of Vareth and looked up at the sky. Somewhere beyond it, there were people who shared her biology, people who had built the pod that had kept her alive, people who used the word love in a way that did not quite translate. She would meet them now. She kept her face still. She did not let herself wonder what they would be like. She had been taught that wondering, without purpose, was a waste. She was not sure she believed that, but she had not yet found the words to say why. The first thing Lyra noticed about the human ship was how quiet it was on the outside. She had expected something that at least tried to look dangerous. The Drakari built their vessels the way they built everything, to communicate power before anything else was communicated. Drakari warships had angles designed to catch light in ways that looked like bared teeth. Even their diplomatic vessels carried a visual weight that said, plainly, "We are serious, and we are large, and you should think carefully before you waste our time." The INS Resolve was not like that. It was a mid-sized vessel, gray-hulled, with running lights that blinked softly along its frame at even intervals. It had no dramatic sweep to its wings, no angular armor plating built for intimidation. It moved through the buffer zone at a steady, unhurried speed, broadcasting its identification signal clearly on all frequencies, like something that had nothing to hide and was not particularly worried about who might be listening. Lyra stood at the viewport of the Drakari escort ship and looked at it for a long moment before turning away. She had been given a clear set of instructions by Varek before she left Vareth. She was to board the human vessel, assess its crew and capabilities, serve as interpreter during the formal diplomatic sessions, and ensure that the humans understood the terms of the meeting. This was not a negotiation between equals. The Drakari Empire was granting an audience. There was a significant difference between the two things, and it was her job to make sure that difference was felt. She had nodded and said she understood, because she did understand. She had been trained for exactly this. The shuttle ride over was short. The Drakari Honor Escort, 6 soldiers in formal black scale plate, arranged themselves behind her with the kind of rigid precision that was meant to be seen. She wore her own formal attire, dark gray, high-collared, the small silver clasp at her throat that marked her as a ward of the first clutch. She had checked herself in the mirror before leaving and found nothing to correct. The docking bay of the Resolve received them smoothly. The clamps locked, the pressure equalized, and the door opened. Captain Adizobi was standing on the other side of it. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness about her that came not from training alone, but from years of actually having to make decisions. She wore a dark uniform with no decoration on it except 2 small markings at the collar that Lyra recognized, from her studies, as rank insignia. She was holding no weapon. She had brought 2 people with her, both of whom stood at a respectful distance, neither of them performing readiness in any visible way. She looked at Lyra. Then she extended her right hand, palm open, thumb upright. Lyra looked at the hand. She had read about this gesture. She had seen recordings of it. She had never done it herself. She reached out and clasped the woman's hand and felt the firm, brief pressure of a human handshake for the first time in her life. "Thank you for coming," Captain Obi said. Her voice was even and warm, not deferential, not performative, just direct. "We've been hoping to talk. Not petitioning, not flattering, not acknowledging the weight of what it meant to be granted an audience by the Drakari Empire. Just, we've been hoping to talk." Lyra held her expression still and said, in standard, "I am Lyra, envoy of the Drakari First Clutch. I will serve as interpreter and representative for the duration of this meeting." "Adiz Obi," the woman said, "this is my ship. Come in." The tour of the Resolve was offered without being asked for. Captain Obi did it herself, which surprised Lyra. The commanding officer of a vessel taking time to walk a foreign diplomat through the ship's corridors was not standard practice in any military she had studied. Varek would never have done it personally. He would have assigned someone. But Obi walked with her and talked easily and answered every question Lyra asked, including the ones about armament and crew capacity, with a directness that left Lyra slightly off balance. She had expected deflection. She had prepared responses for deflection. She cataloged what she saw with the trained eye she had developed over years of studying Drakari military structure. The Resolve's hull was not built for heavy combat. Its weapon systems were adequate for defense and not much else. Its crew complement was small for a vessel this size, just under 200. If Lyra had to write a strategic assessment right now, it would say, clearly, that this ship was not a threat. But there were things she had not expected to see. On the door of one crew member's bunk, which was standing open as they passed, there were drawings. Small ones, done on plain paper and stuck to the surface with something adhesive. A mountain, an animal Lyra did not recognize. a face drawn in simple lines that was clearly meant to be someone the crew member missed. In the kitchen corridor, there was a smell that Lyra had never encountered in any Drakari space. Sweet and warm and slightly burnt at the edges. She did not ask about it because she could not form a question for it that did not sound strange. And in a side corridor near the science bay, 2 crew members were laughing. Not at anything visible. Not at anyone. Just laughing, leaning against the wall, apparently in the middle of a story, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere below the surface. Lyra noted all of it without knowing what category to put any of it in. The one assigned to shadow her for the duration of her time on the ship was a junior crew member named Remy. He was young, perhaps within a few years of her own age, with an easy way of moving that suggested he had never once in his life stood at rigid attention. He fell into step beside her after the tour and immediately started talking. "So," he said, "first time on a human ship?" "Yes," she said. "What do you think so far?" "It is functional," she said. He considered this. "That's possibly the least exciting review anyone's ever given us, but I'll take it." She was not sure how to respond to that, so she said nothing. He did not seem bothered by the silence. He seemed, if anything, comfortable in it, which was unexpected. Most people, in her experience, filled silence with noise because silence made them uneasy. He appeared to have no such problem. He just walked beside her and looked at the corridor walls with the expression of someone who was perfectly content. At one point, she delivered an assessment of the resolves designed to him directly. She said that the ship's frame was built for endurance over speed, that the defensive plating prioritized crew survival at the cost of maneuverability, and that whoever had designed it had clearly prioritized keeping people alive over keeping the vessel competitive in open combat. She did not say it as a compliment. She said it as an observation. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Wow, you're kind of mean. I like it." She stopped walking. He stopped too, a step ahead of her, and turned to look back. He was not being sarcastic. He did not appear to be making fun of her. He said it the way someone says "I like strong coffee," as simple statement of preference, as though her directness was a quality that appealed to him rather than something to be defended against. No Drakari had ever spoken to her that way. The Drakari around her had always responded to her sharpness with matching sharpness, or with the careful neutrality of people who respected her position. No one had ever just, plainly, said they liked it. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it under unresolved and kept walking. The first formal diplomatic session was held in the Resolve's main conference room. Captain Obi and 2 of her advisors sat on one side. Lyra sat between them and the Drakari Honor Escort Commander, a senior soldier named Gavith, who had not smiled once since they left Varith and did not intend to start now. Gavith opened with a statement that was, by Drakari diplomatic standards, moderate and even restrained. It still managed to communicate, in about 4 different ways, that the Empire was doing the humans a great favor by speaking with them at all, that the terms of any future interaction would be set by Drakari interests first, and that the humans should be grateful for the access they were being given. Lyra translated it accurately. It was her job to translate accurately. Captain Obi listened to the whole thing. She did not stiffen. She did not look insulted, or if she was, the insult did not reach her face. When Lyra finished translating, the captain nodded once, slowly, as though she were genuinely considering the statement on its merits. Then she said, "We appreciate the Drakari Empire's willingness to meet with us. We'd like to understand what kind of relationship would serve both our people well. What does the Empire value most in early contact with a new species?" It was a clean redirect. It acknowledged Gavith's statement without conceding to the framing of it. It moved the conversation forward. Lyra translated it into Drakari and watched Gavith's eyes narrow slightly, not with anger, but with the particular expression of someone who has just realized the other person is smarter than they initially appeared. The session went on for 2 hours. Gavith pushed. Obi held her ground without raising her voice once. She gave where it was reasonable to give and did not give where it was not, and she distinguished between the two with a calm precision that Lyra found herself watching more than she should have been. This was not how Lyra had expected the humans to behave. She had been told, in Drakari briefings, that humans were an emotional species, prone to impulsive responses, difficult to predict. She had prepared for that. She had prepared for outbursts, or for anxious over-accommodation. She had not prepared for this. For someone who felt genuinely unafraid. That evening, alone in the small cabin the resolve had given her, she sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and thought about the drawings on the bunk door, and the smell from the kitchen, and the two crew members laughing in the corridor, and the way Remy had said, "You're kind of mean." I like it, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to say. She did not know why these things were staying in her head. They were not strategically relevant. They were not part of her assignment. But they stayed anyway, quiet and stubborn, the way small things sometimes do when they are pointing at something larger that you have not yet turned around to see. She heard it by accident, the way all the truths that change a life tend to arrive. It was the third night on the Resolve. The diplomatic sessions had settled into a rhythm, 2 hours in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, with breaks that Gavith used to send coded reports back to Vareth, and that Captain Obi used to check in with her crew. Lyra used her own breaks to walk the corridors alone, partly out of habit and partly because being in motion helped her think. She was near the communications bay when she heard Elder Sorn's voice. Sorn was not physically on the ship. He was transmitting from Vareth, and the frequency was one used for Drakari internal channels, which meant the humans could not hear it, and Lyra was not, strictly speaking, supposed to be in range of it at this hour. But the door to a side corridor was partially open, and a junior Drakari communications officer was relaying the encrypted feed, and the seal on the corridor was old, and sound traveled. She heard her own name first. That was what stopped her feet. Then she heard Sorn's voice, dry and careful as always, say, "The colony relay vessel was flagged 22 years ago. Drakari Border Control had been monitoring the approach of human vessels in that sector for 4 years prior. The destruction was not accidental. It was consistent with standard border policy at the time. The infant was not an unexpected development. Lord Varek saw an opportunity." A pause. "The ward has served that opportunity well. Her linguistic capability alone justifies the investment. The council is satisfied with the outcome." Lyra stood in the corridor for a long time after the transmission ended. She had been trained not to break. The Drakari did not produce people who broke easily, and whatever she was, she had been produced by the Drakari. So she did not make a sound. She did not move until she was ready to move. She kept her breathing even and her face composed, and she walked back to her cabin and sat down on the sleeping platform. She sat there for a while. Everything she had been told about her origins was technically accurate. A ship had been destroyed. She had been found. She had been brought to Vareth. Varek had decided to keep her. None of these things were lies. They had simply been arranged in a way that left out the part where the ship's destruction was policy, not chance. The part where the Empire had been watching human expansion for years. The part where she had not been found by accident, not exactly, but had been waiting to be found, in the way that all pieces of something planned are waiting for the next move. She was the ward of the first clutch. She had been proud of that. She had understood it as a sign of Varek's character, his adherence to the old principle about hatchlings, his particular kind of honor. It was still a sign of his character. That was still true. It was also a strategy. She did not allow herself to decide what to do with this yet. That was another thing the Drakari had taught her well. When information arrives that disturbs your position, you do not react immediately. You hold it. You look at it from several directions. You decide later, when the initial disturbance has settled. She held it. She went to the observation deck that evening, which was a small room near the rear of the ship with a wide viewport, and a set of low seats built close to the floor in the human style. She was not sure why she went there. She did not make a habit of sitting in the dark and looking at stars. Varek would have had something dry and precise to say about the productivity of that practice. But she sat. After a while, Remy came in. He glanced at her, then at the viewport, and then sat down about 2 seats away from her without asking if she wanted company. She did not tell him to leave. She was not sure why she did not tell him to leave. For a few minutes neither of them said anything. Then he pointed at a cluster of stars near the lower left quadrant of the viewport and said, "That group there, more or less, is what we call the Southern Cross. Depending on where you're standing and which system you're in, it doesn't look exactly right anymore. The names we gave things were based on how they looked from one specific planet a long time ago. We've moved so far from it that the pictures don't quite line up." She looked at the stars. "Then why do you still use the names?" He thought about this in the unhurried way she was starting to recognize as his. Because people taught them to their kids, and those kids taught them to their kids, and somewhere along the way the names stopped being accurate and started being something else. A way of saying, this is where we come from, even if we can't see it the same way anymore. He paused. Some things are worth carrying even when they don't quite fit. She looked at the stars for a long time. She did not say anything about what she had heard through the partially open door. She had not decided whether she was going to say anything to anyone yet. But something about what Remy had just said landed somewhere inside her in a way she could not immediately explain, and she found she did not want to be in motion. She wanted to stay in this room, with the stars outside and someone beside her who was not asking her to perform anything. The next morning, a small crisis arrived quietly and then grew. A human science probe, part of the Resolve's standard deployment, had been operating on an automated survey pattern outside the agreed buffer zone boundaries. Not by much. The deviation was within a reasonable margin of navigation drift. But Drakari patrol instruments were precise, and Gavith brought it to the morning session with the full weight of grievance. He used the word incursion. He used it more than once. Captain Obi sat across the table and listened to Lyra's translation without moving. Then she said, "You're right. The probe crossed the boundary. That's not acceptable, and it won't happen again. I'd like to propose a joint technical review to make sure our survey parameters are fully aligned with the agreed zone. It would prevent this from happening again and give both sides a clearer picture." Gavith was not done. He said, in Drakari, that the carelessness of the humans was consistent with what the Empire had always understood about a species that launched itself into space without adequate preparation, that crossed borders without adequate discipline, and that sent a diplomatic vessel into contact with an elder empire without apparently understanding what it was asking. Lyra translated it. She translated it accurately, because that was her job, and because she was professional, and because she had been trained to be professional above all else. Captain Obi absorbed it. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. Then she said, without heat, "We are reckless. That's fair. We left our home planet in ships that, by most standards, were probably not ready. We've made mistakes in almost every direction you can imagine. We keep going anyway." She met Gavith's eyes, or as close to it as a human could manage when a dragon was looking at her from a great height. "That's why we're here. Not because we had everything right. Because we decided to try anyway and kept trying until we got someone to talk to us." Gavith had no answer for that. It was not the kind of statement that had an obvious counter. It was not aggressive and it was not submissive, and it refused, completely, to be made smaller by his contempt. That evening, a different kind of communication arrived for Lyra. It came through the Drakari channel on her personal communicator, a message from Elder Sorn. It was formal and measured. It acknowledged that Lyra had been in range of the previous transmission and that certain information had been, in Sorn's words, prematurely shared. It confirmed the facts without apology. The colony ship had been flagged. The destruction had been policy. Lord Varek had acted with the interests of the Empire in mind. Lyra's history with the First Clutch was a matter of deliberate choice, not coincidence. The message ended by assuring her that her position remained secure. Her service record was exemplary. The Council had full confidence in her ability to continue the mission. She read it 3 times. The thing that struck her, on the 3rd reading, was not the content. The content she had already processed. What struck her was the framing. Position secure. Service record exemplary. Full confidence in her ability. Every assurance in the message was about her utility. Not once did it say anything about her. Not who she was. Not what had been taken from her when that ship was destroyed. Not what it might mean that she had grown up surrounded by a civilization that valued her for what she produced and considered the context of her existence, the real context, a minor administrative detail. She set the communicator down. She picked it up again. She set it down again. She went to find Remy because she did not want to go to Gavith and she did not want to be alone, and those were the only 2 options on this ship, really, and she chose the one that felt less like standing in a cold room. He was in the common area near the rear of the ship, working on something at a small table. He looked up when she came in and did not say anything, just moved his work to one side to make space, which she took as an invitation, and she sat down. She did not tell him what she had found out. She was not ready to say it aloud to anyone, but she sat there while he went back to his work, and she let the quiet of the room sit around her, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet felt like something different from emptiness. She could not name what it felt like instead. She did not have the word yet. She was beginning to think the word might be a human one. Nobody saw the Greth coming because the Greth were, above all things, patient. They did not broadcast. They did not send signals that could be tracked. They simply moved through the dark spaces between stars, in the places where neither human nor Drakari sensors swept with regularity, and waited until the moment was right. The moment being, two diplomatic vessels sitting in a buffer zone, focused on each other, with attention pointed inward. The alert came at 1400 hours ship time. Not a slow alarm, not a warning tone, but the hard, flat sound of proximity sensors registering multiple vessels emerging from non-standard approach vectors all at once, which was the specific combination of sounds that meant the situation had already moved past the point where anyone had time to think about it carefully. Lyra was in the conference room reviewing translation notes when the sound hit the ship's systems. She was on her feet before the second pulse. Through the viewport, she saw them. 5 Greth strike craft, mid-class, ugly in the way that scavenger ships always were, built from parts of other ships and held together by necessity and refusal. They had dropped out of faster-than-light travel almost perfectly between the Resolve and the Drakari escort formation, which meant whoever had planned this had done so with real knowledge of where both vessels would be. It was not random. Nothing about it was random. The Drakari escort, 3 warships to the Resolve's 1, moved immediately. Their formation shifted into a defensive pattern, and the lead ship opened a channel. Gavatha's voice came through Lyra's earpiece in crisp Drakari. Envoy. Relay to the humans that we are withdrawing to defensible Drakari space. This position is untenable. If the humans cannot match our speed, they will need to manage their own situation. We will not wait. She stood at the viewport and looked at the Greth formation, and then at the Resolve's hull and ran the calculation without needing to write anything down. The Resolve could not match Drakari speed. The Resolve's top speed in emergency thrust was roughly 60% of what the Drakari escort cruisers could produce in full burn. The gap between those two numbers, in practical terms, was the difference between reaching safety and being caught in open space by 5 Greth strike craft with nothing around but empty dark. She should have relayed the message accurately. That was her job. That was what she had been trained to do, and trained well, and she had never deviated from it in any formal capacity in her life. She pressed the comm channel to Captain Obi's position. Captain, the Drakari commander is withdrawing to Drakari space. He offers you the option to follow under escort protection if you can match his speed. He will not wait. It was the first lie she had told in any official capacity. She had given the message a spine it did not have. Gavath had not offered an option. Gavath had announced a decision. But she had said it as an offer, which meant it was something that could be responded to. And responding to it was the only thing that bought the Resolve any time at all. Captain Obi came back on within 4 seconds. What's our match speed? You cannot match it, Lyra said. A pause of 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Then Obi said, get back to me in 90. And the line went quiet. 90 seconds was not a long time. Lyra stood at the viewport and counted them in her head while the Greth formation finished its positioning and the Drakari escort ships began to pull back. Gavath was watching. She knew he was watching. She had told him the humans were being given a choice, which meant he could not cleanly accelerate away without it looking, even to his own counsel, like he had abandoned an ongoing communication. She had bought the Resolve 90 seconds. Possibly more. At the 90-second mark, Captain Obi's voice came back, calm and flat. We're not going to outrun them, and we're not going to win in open combat. We're going to hold position, angle the ship to make ourselves a difficult cross-section target, and see what happens. If the Drakari are still watching, maybe they decide they have an interest in the outcome. If not, we make it as expensive as we can for as long as we can. She said it without dramatics. She said it the way someone states a plan, and then she said, keep translating for me, and the channel stayed open. What happened next was not heroic in the cinematic sense. There was no single speech, no rallying moment with music underneath it. The crew of the Resolve did their jobs. The navigation officer angled the ship. The weapons officer brought the defensive systems fully online. The engineering crew ran power to the hull reinforcement arrays and reduced non-essential systems to minimum draw. People moved through the corridors with purpose and speed and without shouting, and the ship's collective heartbeat, which Lyra could read in the quality of the ambient sounds around her, the pace of footsteps, the clipped efficiency of voices through doorways, went from alert to focused. They were afraid. She could tell. It was not a performance of calm. The fear was real and present, and they were working directly through the middle of it. The Greth lead ship fired a ranging shot, which was a test more than an attack, designed to see if the target would scatter. The Resolve did not scatter. It held its angle, and its defensive grid absorbed the ranging shot, and the weapons officer returned a precise counterburst that struck the Greth ship's sensor array, which was not a crippling hit, but was a very specific one that said, "We know where to aim, and we will keep aiming until we stop breathing." Lyra was watching all of this from the viewport, and she was also watching the Drakari escort formation, which had pulled back to the edge of sensor range but had not, she noticed, entered its return jump sequence. Gavith was still there, still watching. She thought about the old principle. You do not abandon a hatchling. She did not know if Gavith was thinking about principles right now. She did not know if he was moved by anything beyond calculation. But she saw, on the tactical display she had pulled up on a nearby screen, the moment when the Drakari formation began to move again, not away, but back in. Slowly at first, then faster, the 3 escort warships coming around in a hard arc that put them between the Greth strike craft and the Resolve. The engagement that followed was short. 3 Drakari warships against 5 Greth strike craft of moderate class was not a long fight. The Greth were effective against soft targets and against vessels that ran, but they had not planned for a counterattack from warships designed specifically to end things quickly. 2 of their craft broke off immediately. The other 3 held long enough to realize they were losing and then followed. The buffer zone went quiet. Lyra realized she was still standing, still holding the edge of the console she had grabbed at some point during the fight. She released it. She looked at her hands. They were steady. The Drakari had trained steadiness into her so deeply it was almost biological. Gavith opened the channel. He said nothing for a moment. Then, in Drakari, low and without decoration, "You did not run." Captain Obi looked at Lyra. Lyra translated it. And then, without deciding to, without planning it, she added something Gavith had not said. "He says it with respect." She did not examine why she did that. She would examine it later, in the dark, when there was time for honesty. Captain Obi looked at her with something in her eyes that was not quite a question and not quite a recognition, but sat somewhere in the space between them. She said, "Tell him neither did he." Lyra translated that one accurately. The rest of that day was quiet in the way that things are quiet after something loud has passed. The crew of the Resolve moved through their routines with the slightly softened manner of people who had just proven something to themselves. Not triumphant, not loud about it, just quieter in the way that people get when they have done a thing they were not entirely sure they could do and found out they could. Remy found Lyra near the science bay in the late hours. She had not gone to her cabin. She was not sure why. He leaned against the wall beside her and did not say anything for a while, and then he said, "You told Gavith we were being given an option." "Yes," she said. "He didn't offer us one, did he?" It was not a question. She did not answer it. He nodded slowly, looking at the floor. Then he looked up at her. "Thank you," he said. "Just that. No ceremony. No demand for explanation. Just thank you. The way you say it to someone who did something that mattered." She had been thanked many times by the Drakari. For her translations. For her service. For her value to the mission. No one had ever thanked her as plainly as that. For something she had done because she could not bring herself not to. She did not know what to do with the feeling it gave her. She put it away carefully, the way she put things away when they were too large to process immediately, and told herself she would look at it later. She was starting to run out of room in the place where she kept things for later. After the fight, the crew of the Resolve held what they called a debrief. Lyra had attended military debriefs before. On Vareth, they were structured events, hierarchical, led by the senior officer, conducted in order of rank, with findings recorded and disseminated through formal channels. You sat where your rank placed you. You spoke when addressed. You gave your assessment, and you listened to others give theirs, and the whole thing lasted as long as it needed to and not 1 minute longer. This was not that. What the crew of the Resolve held, in the largest common room near the middle of the ship, was something that looked, to Lyra's eye, like controlled chaos. People sat wherever they wanted. Some sat on the floor. Some stood against the wall with plates of food, because someone had apparently decided mid-crisis that now was a good time to prepare a meal, and the smell of it had spread through the ventilation system. People talked over each other, and then gave way, and then talked over each other again. Two crew members in the corner were having what appeared to be a genuine argument about whether the weapons officer should have fired the second counter burst when he did or waited another 3 seconds, and they were both getting animated about it. And then, about 10 minutes into the argument, one of them said something that made the other one laugh, and the argument stopped, and they were apparently fine. No one was performing anything. No one was managing how they looked. The fear that had been real and present during the fight was here too, but it was being released in the way that humans apparently release things, by being in a room together, by eating and talking and arguing and laughing, by making the event smaller through the act of surrounding it with other people. Lyra stood near the doorway and watched. Remy appeared at her side, holding 2 cups. He held one out. She looked at it. "It's called tea," he said. "It's hot and slightly bitter, and it won't do anything medically significant, but people find it comforting. You don't have to take it." She took it. "You can sit down, you know," he said. "Nobody's going to make you explain yourself." She did not sit down, but she did not leave either, which was itself something she had not predicted herself doing. She stood near the doorway and held the cup and let the noise of the room sit around her, and she thought about the word he had used. Comforting. It was a simple word. She knew its definition. She had known it for years. But she had never considered, until right now, that comfort was something that could come from something as small as a warm cup and a room full of noise. Captain Obi found her later, when the debrief had wound down and most of the crew had filtered out. The captain did not come over with an agenda visible on her face. She just walked over and stood nearby and looked at the empty room for a moment, and then she said, "Do you have a few minutes?" They sat in the common room after the last crew member left, at a small table near the viewport. Outside, the buffer zone was dark and quiet again. The Drakari escort had returned to its holding position. The Greth were gone. The universe looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, which was something Lyra found slightly unreasonable given what had happened in it today. Obi asked her where she had grown up. Not where she had been trained. Not what her background was. Where she had grown up, the way you ask a person about a person. Lyra answered. She said Vareth. She said the first clutch estate. She said she had been there from infancy. She said it precisely, the way she said most things, giving information without editorializing. And Obi listened to all of it, including the parts Lyra left short. And when Lyra finished, Obi was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you like?" Lyra looked at her. What? What do you like? Things you enjoy, or that you find interesting for reasons that aren't professional? Lyra opened her mouth. She realized, with a feeling that was new and somewhat strange, that she did not have a ready answer. She had opinions about languages, about strategy, about the structural differences between various diplomatic frameworks. She could speak at length about the history of the Drakari Empire. She could tell you which weapon systems were most effective in low-atmosphere engagements. But what she liked, in the way that Obi appeared to mean, as a person with preferences that belonged to her rather than to her function, she had no clean answer for. She said, carefully, "I find languages interesting. The way different civilizations have words for things that other civilizations don't, and what that says about what they value." Obi nodded. "That's real. What else?" Lyra thought for longer than felt comfortable. "I don't know," she said finally. I think I haven't spent much time considering it." Obi did not fill the silence with something reassuring. She did not say, "Oh, I'm sure you have things you like." She just sat with the answer as though it were a serious and worthy answer, which it was, and then she said, "I think you've been doing something very hard for a very long time. That's not nothing." Lyra looked at her. No one had ever said that to her. The Drakari did not say things like that, because in the Drakari framing, difficulty was expected, and enduring it was simply what you did. There was no language in their vocabulary for acknowledging that someone had been carrying something heavy, because the carrying was the point. The weight was the training. The weight was the honor. This woman had looked at Lyra's life, the summary of it, and named it as difficult, and named the difficulty as something that mattered. Not as weakness, as a thing worth acknowledging. Lyra did not say anything. She was not sure she could say anything right then, without saying something she was not prepared to say. Obi did not push. She just finished her tea and said good night, and left Lyra with the empty room and the dark viewport and her own thoughts. The message from Elder Sorn arrived that night. It came through her personal Drakari channel, encrypted, formally structured. It was not long. It acknowledged that she had been in range of the earlier transmission and that certain background information regarding her origin had been, in Sorn's careful language, available to her without the context necessary to understand it properly. It then provided the context, or what Sorn considered context: administrative notes, policy records from 22 years ago, a brief summary of the border monitoring program that had flagged the human relay vessel, and a notation that Lord Varek's decision to retain the infant survivor had been a personal one, not a council directive, though the council had subsequently found it advantageous. The message ended with an assurance. Her position was secure. Her service record was exemplary. The council had full confidence in her continued performance. She read it 3 times. On the first read, she absorbed the information. On the second read, she noticed the framing. On the third read, she noticed what was not there. There was no apology, not because apology would be wrong, necessarily, but because the concept had not apparently occurred to whoever wrote the message. There was no acknowledgement that the people on that ship had been her parents, or might have been, or that their death had been a policy decision made by the civilization that then raised the child they left behind. There was no sentence that said, "We know this is difficult to learn." There was no sentence that said, "You are a person and this information concerns your life, and your life matters outside of what it produces for us." Just, position secure, service record exemplary, full confidence in continued performance. She put the communicator down. She picked it up. She put it down. She sat on the sleeping platform in her cabin on this human ship in the middle of the buffer zone between 2 civilizations, and she felt something in her chest that she had been carrying, quietly, without a name, for 22 years, shift like weight that has been in one place too long and finally moves. She cried. She had not cried, to her knowledge, since she was an infant. The Drakari did not cry. The Drakari had their own equivalents of grief, which were mostly expressed as silence and withdrawal and increased intensity in training. But the specific human act of producing tears from the eyes while sitting still in the dark was not something anyone around her had ever modeled or encouraged or explained. She did not entirely know why she was doing it now. She cried for the ship, for the people on it who had been flagged and watched and left to the consequence of policy and not considered, in the formal records, as worth a sentence more than necessary. She cried for the version of herself that had stood at the edge of the flame bond ceremony and felt something she could not name because she had no name for it. She cried for every time she had been told to rise without anyone sitting beside her first. She cried because she was 22 years old and she had only just discovered, in the last several days, what it felt like to be in a room where no one required anything from her. She did not know how long she sat there. Eventually, there was a knock at the cabin door. Not Obi. The knock was lighter than Obi's knock. She realized, knew the difference. She wiped her face. She called out that the door was open. Remy came in. He looked at her. He took in, clearly, the state of her face, and he did not look alarmed, or uncomfortable, or like he was calculating how to respond. He just came and sat on the floor near the platform, because there was only one seat in the cabin and she was already sitting on it, and he put his back against the wall and stretched his legs out. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not say anything. He just sat. After a long while, he said, "You don't have to tell me anything." "I know," she said. "Okay," he said, and he stayed. She looked at him sitting against the wall, completely comfortable being somewhere someone was crying without asking for a reason or offering a solution, and she thought, "I do not have a word for what you are doing right now. I have studied 7 languages and I know what the action looks like, but I do not have the exact word for it, from the inside. The word for when someone stays not because they have to and not because it benefits them and not because they are performing goodness, but simply because your absence would feel like a lack to them, and so they are here." She thought, maybe the word is one I am only just learning. She did not say it aloud. She was not ready to say it aloud. But she thought it, and thinking it was the beginning of something. The treaty took 3 nights to write. Not because the language was complicated. It was, in fact, a relatively simple document for what it was, a preliminary non-aggression accord, a framework for future contact, a set of definitions agreed upon by both sides, so that when each used a word, they would at least be referring to the same shape of thing. Simple documents were sometimes the hardest to write, because every word had to be chosen carefully, and because simple documents were the ones that ended up matching most. Lyra drafted the final language with Captain Obi. They sat at the small table in the common room after the rest of the crew had gone to their cabins, and they went through it line by line. Obi would say what she needed the sentence to accomplish. Lyra would find the words that accomplished it in both Standard and Drakari, without losing the meaning in either direction. It was, in many ways, the most technically demanding translation work she had ever done. It was also the first work she had done in her life that felt like both sides of her were being used at once. Around the third night, with the document almost complete, Obi set down her writing instrument and looked at Lyra with an expression that was considering something. "This reads differently than I expected," she said. "In what way?" Lyra asked. "Most treaties I've seen state their terms. This one proposes them." Obi tilted her head. "That was your word. You changed states to proposes in the opening clause." "I noticed." Lyra looked at the document. "Yes," she said. "Because a document that states terms only works if one party has the power to enforce them unconditionally. We do not have that dynamic. Either side can choose to disengage. If we write as though the terms are fixed, we are writing something that neither side will fully trust." Obi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're good at this." "I was trained for it," Lyra said. "That's not what I mean," Obi said. "I mean you're good at it in a way that goes past training." She paused. "I hope whatever comes next for you has room for that." Lyra did not answer. She did not know what came next for her. She was beginning to realize she had never had a clear picture of what came next for her that was not handed to her from someone else's plans. Before the Resolve departed the buffer zone, Captain Obi pulled Lyra aside for a final conversation. They stood near the docking bay, which was humming with the quiet activity of departure preparations. Obi spoke directly, the way she spoke everything. "I'm going to ask you something, and you don't have to answer it." Lyra said nothing, which she intended as an invitation to ask. "How are you?" It was 2 words. Lyra had processed billions of words in her life. She could not recall anyone asking her those 2 in that configuration before. Not Varric, not Dran, not Gavith, not any of the council members she had briefed or the soldiers she had worked alongside. "How are you?" as a genuine question, directed at her specifically, about her internal state and not her operational readiness. She thought about what to say. She thought about the true answer, which was complex and unresolved and had several moving parts. She thought about the shorter version. "I think," she said, slowly, "that I have a great deal to figure out." Obi nodded. "That's an honest answer." She offered her hand, and Lyra shook it. Firm. Brief. "We'll talk again. The Accord makes sure of that." Remy appeared at the edge of the docking bay. He had something in his hand. He walked over and held it out. A piece of paper, the kind they used for handwriting on the ship, folded once. She took it. She did not open it in front of him. He shrugged, which was a gesture she had come to understand meant something like this is not a big deal, but it also is. "Just in case you want to remember what the Southern Cross looks like from this position," he said. "The angles change a lot depending on where you're standing." She held the paper and looked at him and found she had no words that were adequate for the moment. So she just said, "Thank you." And he said, "Safe travel." And she walked back through the docking seal and into the Drakari shuttle. She did not open the paper until she was alone. It was a drawing. Simple lines, clearly not the work of an artist, but careful. A cluster of stars, labeled in small handwriting, with a note underneath. "These are approximate. They always are. Keep them anyway." She folded it again and put it inside her uniform pocket, against her chest. She returned to Varith. The estate of the first clutch was exactly as she had left it. Black stone, open corridors, the amber light of the Varith sky coming through the high windows. She had left it fewer than 2 weeks ago, and it felt, walking back into it now, like she was walking into a room that had not changed but she had, and the mismatch was visible in the edges of everything. Varric received her in the formal study. He sat behind the stone desk that had been in that position for longer than most human civilizations had existed, and he listened to her full report with the focused attention he gave all things that he considered important. She gave it well. She had been trained to give reports well, and she had not stopped being trained just because other things had also happened. She gave him the strategic summary, the Accord framework, the assessment of the Resolve's capabilities and crew structure, the Greth encounter and its outcome, the diplomatic posture of Captain Obi, and its implications for future negotiation. It was a complete report. Varric listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You handled the Greth incident correctly. Gavith has given his own account. The Council will review the Accord text and respond within the month." He looked at her with the particular expression he reserved for assessments he considered final, measuring, and satisfied. "You have served well. The Empire is proud." She took a breath. "I know," she said. "I also know about the colony ship." The room was quiet. Outside, the Varith wind moved across the plateau with the low sound it always made, like something enormous breathing. Varric did not deny it. He looked at her with the measuring expression, unmoving, and then he said, "I see." He said it the way he said most things that required him to acknowledge he had not anticipated them. "The ship was flagged," she said. "Its destruction was policy. I was a strategic asset before I was a ward." She said this without anger. She had thought about how to say it for the entire journey home. Not as an accusation, not as a performance of hurt, as a statement of what was true, delivered the way she had been taught to deliver facts, plainly, with her feet planted. "I want you to know that I understand this. I am not asking you to tell me it was something else." Varric was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You were given every advantage this civilization could offer. Your capabilities, your position, your education. All of it was genuine. The decision was made for the good of the Empire, yes. But you were not misused, Lyra. You were valued." She looked at him. She thought about Sorn's message. "Position secure. Service record exemplary. I believe you thought it was care," she said. "I think you were not wrong about everything." She kept her voice level. "But I want you to know what you were wrong about. Love is not a strategy. It is not what you produce for someone or what they produce for you. I know that now. The humans taught me." She paused. "Someone stayed in a room with me while I was falling apart. Not because it served a purpose. Not because my continued function required it. Just because my absence would have felt like a lack to him, and so he stayed. I did not have a word for that until recently. I do now." Varric looked at her for a long time. His expression did not change in any way that she could clearly read, which was not unusual. He was 300 years old, and he had the kind of face that had learned, over centuries, not to give itself away. Then he said, "And what is the word?" "I am still learning it," she said. "But I know which direction to walk to find it." She was given her customary quarters in the estate. She ate the evening meal alone, which was also customary. She sat at the desk in her room and looked at the Varith night through the window for a while, the amber sky going dark and the stars coming through one at a time. She took out the paper Remy had given her and unfolded it. The drawing of the Southern Cross, slightly creased now, the small handwriting underneath. "These are approximate. They always are. Keep them anyway." She pulled her personal writing tablet toward her. She had never written anything that was not a report or a translation or a strategic assessment. She had never written anything that was just for her. The idea of it felt slightly foreign, the way most things that belong purely to yourself feel foreign when you have spent your entire life defining yourself through your function. She wrote anyway. She wrote, "I am a human who was raised by dragons, and I am only now learning what I am." She stopped. She looked at the line. Then she wrote, "I was taught that love is strength directed at something worth keeping. I believed this for 22 years. I still believe it is partly true, but it is the smaller part. The larger part," she wrote, "is this. Love is what makes someone stay in a dark room beside you when they have every reason to leave. It is the Southern Cross carried across 1,000 wrong skies because someone, somewhere, decided that the name mattered even after the picture stopped fitting. It is a handshake from someone who was not afraid of you. It is a question asked in the real sense. How are you? It is a drawing given without ceremony, folded once, tucked against a chest." She stopped again. She looked at the words. She had been raised by an ancient and proud civilization. She had been given discipline and education and the kind of strength that endures, the kind you can rely on in dark corridors and crisis situations and long debriefs and quiet rooms. She was not going to set that down. She was never going to set that down. It was in her bones now, as much a part of her as anything. But it was not the whole of her. She finished the letter with a sentence that surprised her slightly. appearing at the end of her thoughts the way conclusions sometimes do, not constructed but arrived at. But I know where to start. She folded the letter and set it next to the drawing on her desk. Outside, the Varith stars were fully out now. All those ancient lights that the Dracari had named thousands of years ago in a language that had no word for loneliness. She looked at them for a long time. Then she pulled the tablet back and opened a new document and began to write a second letter, this one with a destination. She addressed it to the INS Resolve diplomatic channel, attention to no one in particular and everyone in general, which was, she thought, the most human way to send something. It began, 3 weeks ago, I learned something about stars. They change position depending on where you're standing. The names stay the same anyway. I think I have been standing in the wrong place. I am beginning to find the right one. She sent it before she could think about whether it was a good idea. Then she sat back, in the amber dark of Varith, with a drawing of imprecise stars on her desk, and the beginning of a word in her chest that she was still learning how to say. And for the first time in a life that had been, in so many ways, full, she felt, quietly and without drama, that she was about to become the most complete version of herself. Not the ward, not the envoy, not the asset, just Lyra. The thing that remained, and kept remaining, and was only now beginning to understand why.